6:15. That's when you check them.
Hey guys, it's Chad from the Teach Better team, and I'm here with someone who just ran an amazing Masterychat, Victoria Thompson. How are
Hi,
you tonight, Victoria?
I am great. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. So you just finished a Masterychat. We were
Yes.
just talking about how crazy fast these chats go sometimes, but that usually happens when the topic is as awesome as it was tonight. And the topic tonight was deprogramming educational norms. And I think this is such an important topic because I think every single teacher in every single classroom needs to be thinking about their norms that they have, the biases they have, and what they're coming into this year with. So what was your motivation for this topic
Yeah.
tonight?
So to be candid, a couple of things happened to get me
Please.
to the point. So I
Yeah.
just got a new role as a STEM instructional coach, which is very exciting.
Congrats.
And thank you. And part of what I do specifically with that role and the organization that I work with is, using, problem-based learning as a vehicle
Yeah.
for equity, and infusing STEM in authentic ways in schools. And then also at the same time, making sure that we have equitable experiences for our students. The reason why I have that job now is because in my old institution, which I loved to work at, there were just a couple of conversations that were happening during that time, especially with like the protests, and Black Lives
Yeah.
Matter. There were a couple of conversations that led me to believe that it might not be my best place for growth. I really enjoyed working there. Like I seriously did, but there were a couple of things that were said where I was like, I just don't know if their mission aligns well with mine. So I
Yeah.
sent in my resume to just a couple of different places, just to kind of get my bearing, because if I wanted to work at the organization, I still could, or not the organization, sorry, my previous institution. I was like, I can totally do that, but let's just kind of see what's out there. I got 5 minutes later, they contacted me for an interview and just to kind of feel out the
Wow.
position. And then by the end of the week, I got the job. So it was a very like whirlwind, type
That's
of,
awesome.
right, like getting a job. But I was like, all right, this is really cool. But just within that journey of having those discussions, getting the new role and now molding into this new role, I myself have done a lot of deprogramming because I taught in South Carolina. And then I was working at like a private independent school. Both places, although lovely, were very much entrenched in a lot of this stuff with the educational norms,
Sure.
which really made me think about what I did in my classroom to deprogram that, right? And then also made me think about what other teachers are doing as well to deprogram it. So especially with, virtual learning on the horizon, teachers going back to school, there's no better time to have this
I
conversation.
agree. Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. There's
Yes.
a couple things that I really kind of like connect with a lot of the work we do, and that kind of I inherently connect with, and that's I spent my career in a STEM school, so I love PBL, I love project-based learning, and all of those things. But I also feel like when you give students autonomy and ownership, you're providing a more equitable environment organically, right? So like allowing students to follow their passions through things like projects. A lot of our work is in the PBL, but also mastery learning, self-paced learning, some of those things as well. And it's when you give students a little bit more freedom that they find themselves in the learning, right? And when you're giving them that room is when they can really that's when you create that equitable environment. So I love the fact that you mentioned how you can create equity with good instructional practices that are inclusive and engaging for learners, right? And I think that's something that I feel like we see them as two buckets sometimes, like equity and instruction.
Viewed as like either or instead of both and when
Yes.
they coexist. And like these things can coexist. You can have equitable instruction, decolonize your curriculum, and still be a good teacher, not at the expense of what you're supposed to be taught. And I find a lot in just secondary environments, there's a lot of, we're not going to do this at the expense of the curriculum, right? Or so like I was at an IB school where there's like a certain amount of things that need to be in for the IB test.
For sure. I've seen those syllabi. Yeah.
we can have equitable practice and equitable instruction and have these things in our curriculum, not at the expense of what we're supposed to be teaching. So I always view my like curriculum guide or like my pacing guide as like my testing syllabus instead of my teaching syllabus. And then that entire spin just completely changes the viewpoint. And now that I'm a coach, and I also write curriculum myself, my master's is in curriculum reading. Like I explicitly state in every curriculum that I write, this is your testing syllabus, not your teaching syllabus. And even though these are the standards and these are the things you need to hit, you like, here are some cool ways to infuse like non-Eurocentric thinking, alternative text, alternative assessment, right? And that kind of goes also with the framework of white supremacy traits, where like I don't want everything to be like worship of the written word. If a kid can make a project or tell me how to do a math problem or like a science experiment, then a lab paper, even though like we will do them from time to time, it's not, again, the only way, which is another, trait of white supremacy framework. So I really do a lot of work making sure that these things are debunked and deconstructed.
Yes, I absolutely love that last point you made about the fact that like the syllabus is a testing guide. Or the curriculum is a testing guide, not a teaching guide. So it's like because the teaching should be sort of an authentic experience for the students, an organic experience for the students, an experience they can connect with and engage in, right? As opposed to sort of like just this list or checklist of standards and targets and everything else. So I absolutely love that you mentioned it. And you are right, especially in these higher ed. I think when we talk about later middle school, high school, I think we get some of these entrenched norms in classrooms. One of the things you brought up tonight were sort of like the idea of like behavioral policing, right? This idea that like our job as teachers is to change behavior of students, right? As opposed to like teach them and inspire them. And that really hit home for me, right? Because you also talked about how students show mastery. And that was another thing you just talked about, in the fact that maybe they're not strong writers, but they can draw a picture or draw a diagram, do a project, right? And I talk to teachers incessantly about, what are you assessing? Because I've talked to like English teachers before that'll go, I need a student to be able to write an argument. But then they grade a bunch of grammar on the paper. And I go, hold on. Do they have a sound argument? Is it backed with evidence? Is the evidence cited? That's what you're measuring. You're not measuring grammar right now. So like, I think it also comes from a planning and a curriculum and a lesson planning design standpoint, where you have to go, know what you're measuring and then be true to that, as opposed to bringing in all these biases and other norms, right? Like, you didn't say this how I would have said it, or you didn't phrase this the right way, or you didn't use the right punctuation. Well, if you're not grading punctuation right now, the student should be penalized for that, right? So I 1,000% agree with that. So how, as a teacher, I'm sitting here and I'm reflecting on this chat tonight. I'm reflecting on your fantastic questions. And if I'm in our audience and I'm thinking, by the way, I want to say hello to Olivia, Jeff Kaplan, Lindsay Titus is here as well. We got people coming in out of the woodwork.
Or actually, probably you can see, but I can't. Can we see like who's here right now?
I can see the comments. I can't see the list of people. I can't see the list of people. So we do have some people saying, hey. Facebook user, I don't know who that is, but they said great chat, and it was a great chat. You did an awesome job. Olivia Chan did an amazing job in the chat as well. But let's talk for a minute about unacceptable disruptive behavior. An example that I always go back to is sort of like a student working but sitting on the floor, right? Like I had students that did this in my own classroom, and I would never really correct this behavior, because if they were comfortable, they were focused, and they were working, why would I want to disrupt that, right? Like, my thought was, if you're working and you're comfortable, like let's do that. And I had a great conversation one time with a colleague that says, well, why do you let them do that in your classroom? I said, well, first of all, they're being productive, they're learning, they're growing, and I'm building trust. And I don't want to ruin that by demonizing the way that they think they should work. Also, I don't know how they work at home. Maybe maybe they're used to sitting on the floor and working, and that's how they're comfortable, right? And so I think taking these things into perspective is so powerful as a teacher. What are some other like examples or things that like you see really commonly that teachers are just jumping all over students for, that they really just need to like reevaluate?
I don't even know where to begin.
I know there's a lot, right? I knew I just pried open the can, right, of worms that is this discussion. But like, if you can think about like 3 to 5 most common things that like you think teachers should maybe reevaluate their stance on, I was just curious.
I'll speak from my experiences with working in both private and public, because I think that they're both valid in this space. My number one that I cannot wrap my head around is uniforms. And I'm a product of New Jersey K through 12 public education. I never went to a private school. I went to a public college for both my like graduate and my undergraduate degree. Like uniforms and dress codes were just not things that I ever had to deal with. And then when I worked at my private school, it was like a different world. And there were different levels of uniform. There was dress uniform, there was uniform, there was
wow.
Day, so like for Spirit Day, you can wear different colored socks and different colored shoes, but you still had to wear like your skirt or like your pants and like your shirt. For dress uniform, it was like a little it was like a wool, words are escaping me right now. It was like a sweater vest. It was like a wool sweater vest, a white, shirt underneath, and it had to be collared, and you had to wear, like leggings or, socks. And, I worked out of public schools in South Carolina where sometimes we were just happy if the kids came clothed, right? Like if they were just clothed appropriate.
I'm with you. Yeah.
About. And that was
or
a very
temperature appropriate. Yeah. Like, so they were like warm enough. Yeah.
Right. And so again, being candid, sometimes I would get emails like, well, somebody was egregiously out of uniform, and I heard that, she was in your room, or, so-and-so was wearing pink socks. And to me, I'm like, how does them wearing pink socks affect what they're doing in my room and how they're learning? So I was definitely not a stickler for the uniform, not nearly as much as some of my colleagues were. That did get me into a little bit of heat, but at the end of the day, I was like, it might be a school policy, and I'm always down to follow school policy, but I just kind of turned a blind eye because there are so many other things that are more important than.
Yeah, it's like, I had the same thing with like hoodies.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I also think that dress codes and uniforms unfairly target girls and young women, especially in the private school environment. Skirts have to be a certain length, shirts have to be up a certain height. You don't really see those same restrictions on boys and young men.
Absolutely
so
agree.
That's why I really am not a stickler when it comes to uniforms or dress codes. Now, if it's to the point where like the student is uncomfortable, or maybe if there's something inappropriate, if there's violence on it, that's where I'll draw the line. But
I'm with you.
Yeah, for the most part, I'm like, if you're comfortable and if you're not being disruptive, and if you're learning, then totally cool. So
that's it.
Yeah, uniforms I don't get, and I don't think I'll ever get. Another thing when it comes to schools and just kind of like disruptive behaviors, I never got the whole quiet in the hallway thing. And when I say that, I mean specifically like walking in a line quietly, like on the side of the hall. I think that there are different ways to get from point A to point B and not necessarily have to be quiet as a mouse, but still being respectful of other people's space. And I find this an interesting dichotomy because, in high school, teachers don't walk you from place to place, right?
Right.
So even when I taught at the middle school level, as teachers, we had to walk kids to and from electives.
I had experiences like this. Absolutely.
Yeah. When I was growing up and when I was in middle school, we did not get walked from special to special. So I don't know if that's like a shift, that's recent, or maybe that was just where I worked, but I did find it very interesting and unique that I had as the adult to kind of still be monitoring and managing kids who I thought that at that time they should still be able to kind of police themselves. Not to use the word police, but I think that they totally should have been able to get from point A to point B. And then, of course, class schedules are different. There's like a million kids in the hallway. There's nobody saying walk in a line. So I would just like to see more continuity, because eventually they are going to have that release of responsibility.
Sure.
They have to be able to handle it. And we as adults need to break that stigma of the only way to get from point A to point B is walking in a straight line. So that's number 2. Number 3, I would have to say, like, disruptive behaviors, like tapping your pencil, moving out of your seat, calling out. These are all things I always find with teachers to be like, when it's a very teacher-centered classroom and not a student-centered classroom. Of course, there are times and places where that's not going to be appropriate, right? Like if I'm speaking or if I'm helping another student, like one of my big pet peeves is when kids like tap me on the back when I'm working with somebody else. So I kind of have to redirect that attention. But these are not like disruptive behaviors. These are just kid behaviors, right? So it's our job to create a space and create a culture where it might not be like the norm. Like, I don't think that kids should be calling out, because then, it gets kind of hard to hear people, but we can facilitate meaningful discussion. We can also facilitate instruction ourselves that's, is student-centered and authentic, because I don't think that these things should be seen as disruptive. Like if I think I have a pencil. I do have a pencil in front of me. If I need to sharpen a pencil, why do I have to ask a teacher to get up and do that? Sharpening a pencil takes 5 seconds, and it's not going to be that disruptive. It's something that I've never understood, and I don't think I ever will. So those would probably be, I know I just talked a lot, but those are my top 3 that I'm just
enjoying listening at this point. So I'm right there with you, right? So the 3 things you mentioned were dress code, talking out, and walking in a straight line silently. Okay. I gravitate towards the silently one. I think that applies to like in the classroom, and that kind of goes to the calling out as well, right? Like if you have a group of silent students in a classroom where just the teacher's voice is being heard, that is a 100% passive learning environment in a teacher-centered environment, right? So now we are creating this teacher centricity which I think actually was a lot of where this stems from, right? Like this need to like control, because when I work with teachers on letting go on some of those reins, kind of a lot like you probably do with PBL and letting them do more open-ended assignments and have more ownership, right? It's like the same idea of like, when I'm getting teachers to let go, it's getting them to let go of that control, right? Because often a classroom where a project is running is not a silent classroom. It's an engaged, it's a meaningful learning classroom, right? A classroom that's self-paced and student-centered is not going to be a silent classroom. And the idea that like if a classroom's quiet, those kids must be engaged, or like that teacher must have good management. No, that teacher's a tyrant. Like that's the only thing that teachers.
When I was student teaching, so like my cooperating teacher was awful. But I was observing in some other classrooms as like part of transitioning out. And there was a 2nd grade teacher who had like this rule where like you stay silent. Like you are quiet. They were the quietest 2nd graders I think I've ever seen in my entire life. Yeah. They didn't talk. Even when they were collaborating with each other, they were like pointing and like using cards. Like there was no communication at all. And it really put into perspective for me, like the lack of experience they were getting in that classroom. And I think that as adults, sometimes we kind of normalize like noise level ourselves. So like, for example, I've got a dog who I like post about all the time. And like he sometimes is in the window, and if someone walks by that he doesn't recognize or notice, sometimes he'll bark. And then like, of course, it's annoying to me, but I have to remember like he's a dog, right? That's what dogs do. They're going to bark if they see something that's not clear to them. We have to think of kids in the same way. And I don't like to compare kids to animals, but I think that sometimes—
No, I get the point you're making. I see the point you're making now, yeah.
What we tolerate as adults is entirely different from what the threshold is for kids. Kids are going to talk, kids are going to be loud, kids are going to ask questions, they're going to be animated, they're going to be kind of busy, is how I describe it. just because we're kind of phased out of that as adults, and we've also been conditioned to view these as negative behaviors in the workplace, in personal relationships, romantic relationships, kids are still kind of figuring that out, what's appropriate for them, what their comfort level is, and what's not their comfort level. We can't expect for kids to act like how we do, because like I'm 26 and I'm working with an 8-year-old. So the 8-year-old is not going to have the same emotional intelligence, spatial awareness, like noise control as I do. And it's not our job as the teachers to police it, but it's our job as the educators and the teachers in the room to give outlets, to create a space for students to feel their authentic self.
So much awesomeness just came out. I don't even know where to begin or to even come back to. No, that was absolutely fantastic. So I don't want to keep you all night, Victoria. I know you have some delicious dinner waiting for you that I think your wife is attempting to cook, right?
For me, the most interesting time to learn how to not read a recipe. Yeah. I've just kind of been like going back and forth between like my office and
Absolutely. So I'm gonna kind of try to wrap things up a bit here, and I think I'm gonna end with this question. And this is I like to end these with a pretty simple question. I'm a teacher. I just heard all the amazing knowledge you just dropped on our entire network. I just experienced this awesome chat. I was reflecting all night. What do I do tomorrow? What do I do in the coming weeks before the year starts? What are some first steps? And I think you've mentioned a couple as we've been talking, but like if I'm going to do something tomorrow to rethink my classroom, like what would be your like gut reaction for like a tip to give someone?
Yeah. Ooh, so I actually do this quite a bit, right? So I've actually gotten myself into a bit of trouble with this with some friends because
the best ideas get us in trouble.
Right, yeah. They will, read White Fragility, they're attending the seminars and the conferences, and that's just kind of where the conversation starts and stops. And then I, of course, follow up with, well, then what are you going to do? And then instead of hearing what are you going to do, what they hear and internalize is, so I hear that you're mad at me because I haven't, blah, blah, blah. So then that also requires a little bit of, conversation and programming literally, because I'm not deprogramming. I am programming to say, because I'm questioning you, I'm not mad at you. I am legitimately interested in what are you doing next? You've attended the conferences, you've done the chats, you've read the resources. What are actionable next steps that you can take to be a better learner, be a better educator? Because racism and white supremacy and like all of these norms that we kind of have in education, it's not going to be solved in a summer. It is going to take much longer than a couple of different things in order for you to do things, right? So what I always people is that it's okay to start small. Like tip number 1, it's okay to start small. You don't need to move mountains with what you're doing, but even little things, like somebody in the chat tonight mentioned that even small things like having diversity in word problems. How many times do you see names like John, Jeff, Lily, Amy, but you don't see names like, now words are escaping me. But like the
Jamal like I'm thinking of some of my old friends.
Tyreek, right? So many of the names are Eurocentric. And it's just little things like that bring visibility. And I know that's like bare minimum diversity, but it's a start, right? So it's okay to start small. The second thing that I always encourage people to do is go directly to your institution wherever you're working. And then what I usually do is I'll find people that are kind of on board and we'll kind of create a task force or we'll start the conversations, but then going directly to the institution and saying, here's what I'm noticing, right? Here's what I'm noticing. What are we going to do about it? So like at my last institution, one of the questions I still don't have an answer to is when did we integrate? We were a private, independent institution. When did we integrate? When did we get our first student of color? And to this day, I do not have an answer. I think every single institution should be able to answer that, as well as questions as to how are we retaining and recruiting faculty of color? How are we making sure that our spaces are safe for faculty of color and students of color? If these questions are not either addressed or explicitly written into mission statements and have a task force, that's a problem. So as an educator, as teachers, we can be the change. We can be the movement. Create a task force or a group of like-minded educators who are at least starting to have conversations like this. And if you don't have any at your institution, which does unfortunately happen sometimes, there are tons of people on Twitter, professional learning networks, and other networks that are more than happy to help you mobilize. We're all kind of in this space together, and we're all remote anyway. So we're always happy
right now.
Yeah. And then third and final with that, taking a look specifically at your curriculum, your respective curriculum, and figuring out what you can do to do what I call decolonizing it. So like for me as a STEM educator and a former math teacher, a lot of math embodies those white supremacy culture traits, things like worship of the written word, with most math tests being like paper pencil, perfectionism, which is why I use anonymous platforms like Pear Deck and Buncee that kind of take away that stigma of being up on the board and being wrong, right? If they're not right, then they internalize the mistake. There are things that you can do within your curriculum slowly but surely that decolonize some of that and make it a more accessible curriculum for your students.
Wow, fantastic. So if people want to stay connected with you, learn more about you, kind of work with you, like what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yes. So I've got my Twitter handle. It's at Victoria the Tech. I'm pretty active on Twitter, but I do check notifications like in the morning and in the evening, because now that I'm an instructional coach, I do work over the summer a lot. That's the best way.
You and every instructional leader in the country is going overtime right now.
Right. Even though I don't have like the capability or capacity to make a lot of the decisions like regarding remote learning, I have 100% empathy for anybody tasked with making these decisions, because it's really hard. It's really hard.
However, you do have the privilege of creating the bridge to get educators to work within that environment, right? So I actually truly believe that the work that you're doing is absolutely fantastic and amazing, and I applaud you for it. I have a true belief that with quality instruction that is student-centered, we can close the gap between whether it's remote, in the classroom, or somewhere in between, right? If we create student-centered learning environments, whether it's with PBLs, whether it's with mastery or self-paced learning, whether it's with, equitable learning practices, like when we put these things in place, learning doesn't become place-centric. It doesn't become something that can only happen because you're at a geographic location at a specific time during the day, right? It becomes an immersive experience that continues beyond the walls of the classroom. And I really think that's what a lot of teachers need right now. And I'm so glad that you help teachers kind of reevaluate some of these things tonight. We definitely have to talk more because you're pretty awesome. I don't know when that's going to be. I'm pretty sure you're going to be on our podcast soon as well, which I'm pretty excited about. So, I'm going to listen to that episode a couple of times, I think. So, you did an absolute great job tonight, Victoria. I want to thank you for taking the time and waiting for your dinner. Please apologize to your wife on behalf of the Beach Butter team.
It's all good.
And if your wings got ruined, you can blame us. Okay, is that fair?
And said that they looked good. So I think that at this point they're just in the warmer. So now, of course, I'm the cook in the house. I cook everything for the most part, and then Courtney is like the cleaner and like the tidier and the organizer. So she actually texted me. She was like, "I think that they look done." I'm like, "Just leave them out. Keep them in the warmer." So we're gonna see how they turned out.
Well, good luck with your wings, Victoria. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and have a fantastic night.
Yes, thank you. Have a good night.
Bye.